All right, welcome everybody. Today I'm going to be lecturing on the Carlisle Indian School, which is in assignment 1, part 3, Whose American Dream? Okay, let's go to the images. So the Carlisle Indian School, here is the question, and you will find the question. I'm going over to the modules. Here's assignment 1, okay, and part 3, which is due September 14th. Oh, admit. Hello, Parker. Are you there? All right, take 2. Here we go. Share screen. So we're going to be covering, if you click on part 3, assignment 1, Whose American Dream? And if you scroll down, Past Reconstruction, the Second Civil War. This is a powerful documentary. I hope you all enjoy it. And then if you scroll down a little bit more, there's a question about the Carlisle Indian School, number 13. And this is what I'm going to be discussing right now. So without further ado, and just let me know if you have a question or anything. As we're rolling, I'd love to hear myself stop talking and accept the question or two. Okay, there's it. Here's the question. What strikes you about the policy to, quote, kill the Indian and save the man at the Carlisle Indian School? How does Pratt justify the creation of the Carlisle Indian School? For this, you will also look and read this couple-page report in which he justifies the policy at the Indian School to, quote, kill the Indian and save the man. And then more controversial, I'm asking you this question. Were the Carlisle School Indians lucky for the opportunity to be Americanized? Were they ethnically cleansed, meaning they had their cultural identity stripped away, or something else? In other words, I just want you to analyze the legacy of it as you see. So in the 1800s, along with how to deal with the institution of slavery and now all these freed African Americans that you saw in the Reconstruction film, the other big US dilemma in the 1800s is what to do with Native Americans. What do we do with Native American lands, emptied lands, and what do we do with the people? Well, for much of the 1800s, the US official policy was to conquer and remove Plains Indians and other Indians who resisted colonization. Captain General Richard Platt headed up this in the Plains. He was one of the main guys in charge of it. And one of the examples I'm offering you about when Plains Indians were conquered, the warriors were conquered and then removed, is here's Captain Pratt back here on the left-hand side, conquered these warriors, forcefully removed them, put them on trains, and they went to Fort Marion Prison in Florida. Here's one of the pictures, not of all 72 warriors, but a substantial number of them. And as you know, reservations were often on some of the worst lands, the driest lands, the hardest to farm, or with a few other resources at hand. Here's a rather sad image of the Rosebud Reservation in the Dakota Territory. So Pratt's Quaker wife despised this policy, right? And Pratt wasn't a big fan of it either, but he followed through. He was a cog in the machine to make this process of conquest and removal manifest. So Pratt's wife lobbied him, and then Pratt lobbied the federal government to invest money. And remember, at this time, the federal government's trying to cut its budget because the Civil War cost a lot of money. So they're trying to cut its budget. The Indian Wars have cost a lot of money. So it's a rather controversial program. And the program was to refit this military school in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and turn it into a school that quote unquote, educated native peoples, various native peoples who spoke all kinds of native languages, bring them into this military school and literally what they said, kill the Indian and save the man, to Americanize them, turn them into settler Americans. Here's a rather, I don't know, disturbing image of all these young people, right, wearing the same uniform, same haircut. And it went from 1879 to 1918, and about 15,000 Native Americans went through its doors. While most of, let's go back to this image, while many of these young people were forcefully kidnapped from their families and brought to the school, some Native American folks willingly, or what choice did they have, sent their kids to the school. For example, when Pratt tried to recruit Spotted Tail's kids to bring them, to have him give the okay to bring them to the school, Pratt's argument to Spotted Tail was, hey, we'll teach your children English, we'll teach them American ways so they can thrive in this new American settler society. Spotted Tail's like, no thanks, we have our own ways, which we like just wonderfully, no thank you. Pratt retorted, hey, you know the white man will not stop, right? You know this is the wave of the future. And Spotted Tail said, okay then, and he offered up a number of his children to go be, quote unquote, educated in the Indian camps. To much fanfare, when I say this, in October 1879, because the federal government was paying for this educational program, and because many Americans were like, why are we even bothering Americanizing them? On the other hand, many Americans said, you know what, this is a much more humane thing to do, right? Let's send them to school and turn them into ethnic Americans. So there were many journalists on the scene. There's many photographs and reports about this school during the duration of its life, and that's why we know quite a bit about it. On the first train, 63 Sioux boys and 23 girls arrived to the school, and reports are that they were rather horrified by the train ride. Most had never been in a train. They had just come from a war zone, and they were stuck in this box for a couple days as it chugged eastward to Pennsylvania. So the journey itself, according to many of the young people who experienced it, was terrifying. Once they got off the train and entered the Carlisle Indian School, they were separated into boys and girls, right? Their picture was taken beforehand. Then they were given this extreme makeover, and another photo was taken. And again, one of the main reasons there's a before and after photo is to show the American people like, hey, look at, we're doing it. We're turning this Native American kid into an American settler kid. There's numerous of these photographs. Native young people's names were also changed. So part of the stripping away of their ethnic identity was to strip them away of their clothes. They weren't allowed to practice their religious rites. They weren't allowed to use their native names. So for example, these folks from the New Mexico territory were brought, they were taken a picture of right when they arrived, and then afterwards in these military style wool uniforms. Wate became Sheldon Jackson, and Kisetewa became John Shields. So naming, right? Naming is an important identifier. Like military schools across the US, students woke up at the crack of dawn to the sound of a bugle, right? Put on their uniforms, spit shine their shoes, and marched and practiced drills. Right, this is the similar, right? Pratt designed this school after military schools across the US. And again, they had their names stripped from them. They could not speak their native language at the school. If they would, there'd be an enforcer to enforce the rules. Here's this big guy back here. They weren't allowed to wear moccasins or have their hair or dress as they did traditionally. And again, weren't allowed to practice their religion. Many of the teachers were from northern churches, and they were these mostly well-meaning white northern teachers who thought, really, we're going to help these kids by teaching them the settler American way. So what did they teach them? Again, segregated schools. They were taught reading, writing, math. They were taught in a classroom adorned with the images of, here's President Washington right here, and here's the current President McKinley. This is in the late 1800s. And here they are, all dressed up, learning to count, it seems like. After the morning session of reading, writing, and arithmetic, boys went into and learned industrial skills. Here's a couple of the examples of the industrial skills the boys learned. This looks like a printing, yeah. They're learning printing here, and up here some sort of science stuff. What do you think the girls learned? Well, the girls, after learning some reading, writing, and arithmetic, went and learned these gendered roles of sewing, laundry, and baking. And of course, they knew how to sew, do laundry, and bake, but now they were learning how US settler women sewed, laundered, and baked. Here they are using one of the relatively new inventions, the Singer sewing machine, right here. For some children, and again, we know this from the reports they drew and they wrote out, for some children, the school did offer a refuge from the violence of colonization, whether that was from US armies coming and invading their villages or from native on native violence. Okay, so for some children, they did express the fact that it was safer here at the Indian school. This is a powerful drawing I chose to share with you. A young man by the name of Woha drew this, and he named it Woha in Two Worlds. He misspelled two. Of course, the kind of two he was referring to is two, T-W-O, but I just wanted to keep the original spelling here for you. And I don't know if you can make it out, but on the left-hand side of the drawing, there's a buffalo, a teepee, and some foods that he had gathered. On the right hand of the drawing is a domesticated cow brought over by the Europeans from Europe, a square house. I know you can't see it, but it's a traditional settler square house. And then a plowed field, right? Very orderly plowed field. And you can just see Yahoo's stuck between these two worlds, trying to reconcile the fact that he grew up in this traditional lifestyle on the left, but there's this other lifestyle being forced upon them, and he's just literally in two worlds. That's a powerful one. Let me check something real quick. Okay, right, back to this. Just to show you the ambivalence many students felt, meaning like they were torn asunder at the school. It's, imagine these kids living through, you know, having these post-traumatic stress from the wars, and they come in, oftentimes they're orphans, but not this little kid. This is a letter written by a 9-year-old kid, and my gosh, it just sounds like my 9-year-old kid brother speaking back in the day. But get at what he's, right? As historians, we have to look at these primary pieces of evidence, primary documents, and try to get at the larger context. So let me read this letter written by a young student to his father. My dear father, I thought I would write you a few lines. I liked the place very much, and there was one Negro boy got killed on the railroad. And we have a very nice farm and cold water to drink. And would you send my bows and arrows? Whoa, he wants his bows and arrows. How is my little pony getting along? I would like to know how are you getting, and would you please send some money? And we have a great many boys and a great many girls, and the boys have a small house. I wish they'd play the band. I have a bed to myself. And I am coming home in 2 years now if Captain Pratt will let me. And how are you getting along with the big house? And will you tell me in your letter when you write, when we got here, I did not like the place, but got used to the place, and I like it very well. But I felt very homesick. And be sure and send my bow and some spike arrows. Whoa, what's he planning? And we go to church every Sunday, and I have a blue suit, and there was one Cheyenne boy shot himself with a pistol. And the boys have a nice green lawn, which they play kicking a football. And how are you getting along with your stock? Oh my gosh, there's a lot there to unpack, right? So check it out. They're playing American football. One Cheyenne boy committed suicide, got a hold of a pistol. He committed suicide. He wants his spike arrows, right? He's getting used to the place. He's going to church every Sunday. He saw what he called a Negro boy who got run over on the railroad tracks, right? There's a lot to unpack there. So I look forward to your analysis about this letter. It seemed to many Americans who supported these Indian schools, and Carlisle was just one of many throughout the nation. The very famous Reverend Henry Ward Beecher, he was the reverend who would be the reverend for like the presidents. He was one of the most important preachers in the country at the time. He said of the Indian schools in 1890, Indian schools are the stomachs of the country in which all people that come to us are assimilated within a generation. When a lion eats an ox, the lion does not become an ox, but the ox becomes a lion. Those are powerful words, right? And it's rather disturbingly powerful. American Horse agreed to have a bunch of his kids go to the Carlisle Indian School. And here they are, an image of seemingly on the surface at least, Americanized Plains Indians. Okay, again, they got their picture taken to show. Let me tell you a little bit about this fellow, Tikematse. And for some reason that I don't know, his name was not changed throughout his tenure at the Carlisle Indian School and even afterwards when he graduated and got a job. He kept his name Tikematse, which means squint eyes in Cheyenne. He went to the school, graduated, and then he went and got a job with the relatively new Smithsonian Institution, right? This is a federally funded museum in Washington, D.C. And part of his job at the Smithsonian Institution was to decipher Plains Indian Sign Language. Okay, so that was one of the jobs he did with an anthropologist, right? Help the anthropologist decipher the sign language used by Plains Indians. Another job he had was to be on display, right? Here he is in his work outfit. He went and put on, right? Put a wig on, put a quote unquote Plains Indian outfit on and played Indian. Interesting, huh? He worked for quite a few years there. Many Carlisle Indian graduates went to work as actors at these very popular Wild West shows. Wild West shows were as popular as blackface shows. Yeah, the other more popular sort of entertainment for Americans was to go to these, they call them blackface shows, and we're going to talk about these more next assignment, right? White people with blackface performing. Minstrel shows, they're called. It was really an honor for many students to be chosen. Am I sharing my screen? Yeah. Yep. It was honor for the top students to be chosen to play in the band because the band was very prestigious and well, according to their accounts. And in fact, it played at all the presidential inaugurations from 1879 to 1918. They were in the front of the parade, right? Celebrating the incoming US president, just to show you how important to the federal government and many others this Carlisle Indian School of Assimilation was. Another very important aspect of the school was their football team. And what's a more American thing to do than to play football? Here is the football team, right? They look like football players, right? Big old guys. Their coach at a certain time was the famous Pop Warner. If any of you all played football as younger folks, you might have played Pop Warner football. It's named after the coach of the Carlisle Indian School team. And for the duration of its existence, the Carlisle Indian School team played really competitively. They played the powerhouses of the time. There was no professional football yet as we know it. So the powerhouse teams at the time were Yale, Harvard, and Columbia. And they started to play, especially on Thanksgiving. Parker, what's significant about Thanksgiving? What do many Americans do on Thanksgiving? And you can just chat it out if you want. Chat. Eat. What else? What do we usually watch when we're eating at Thanksgiving? What's on the TV? Football. Exactly, thank you. And some of the football games were literally Cowboys versus Indians, right? They were this Native American team, right, versus white Americans. And some of the earliest professional football games played on Thanksgiving were Redskins versus Cowboys, right? Cowboys versus Indians. This is why Thanksgiving is an important day for football, started by the Carlisle Indian School. The Indian School produced many, many athletes. Jim Thorpe was one. Chief John Myers was one. Chief was his nickname. Okay. That others gave him, of course, right? Non-native peoples gave him that nickname. Carlisle graduates enlisted into World War I. A couple of the Choctaw graduates who were bilingual communicated military strategy in Choctaw. Later on in World War II, Navajo talkers would also communicate strategy in the Pacific Front in Navajo, a language the Japanese did not break in World War II, nor did the Germans in World War I. And in part, thank you for all your service in World War I. Native Americans were finally granted citizenship. All Native Americans were granted citizenship, not till 1924. How ironic is that? A little late, don't you think? And they're still around. Toyon was the Indian school here in Redding near Shasta Lake. This Riverside Indian School in Oklahoma is the oldest one in continual use. And that's my lecture on the Carlisle Indian School, okay? I am going to switch gears a little bit now and just ask, why do many Americans like to play Indian? Parker, I'm gonna pick on you again. Why do many Americans like to play Indian? What do you think? Did you ever play Cowboys and Indians growing up, Parker? Football. Well, many have. Here's from the Campfire Girls, right? Here's some other kids playing Indian. In fact, here's that German Jewish guy who knew some math and escaped Germany before the Nazis got him and came to the United States. Albert Einstein went to the Hopi House in the Grand Canyon, went to the gift shop and put on this Plains Indians hat. Hopi people did not wear these feathered headdresses. They did not. But many Hopi folks said, oh yeah, the white folks, they like that feathered headdress thing. So there it is. There you go, Einstein. During the Boston Tea Party, many American revolutionaries protesting British policies dressed as Mohawks, not in order to disguise themselves, but to really take on Native Americans as mascots, right? This is one of the earliest times in which white Americans dressed as Indians just to making Indians their mascots. And using natives as mascots is as old as our nation's history. You can go back to the Boston Tea Party. And only recently, even though Native peoples have been complaining about this for years and decades, only recently have the Washington Redskins decided to change their name. The Cleveland Indians recently got rid of theirs, right? Land O'Lakes got rid of their symbol of this Native American woman slinging butter. Okay, and others. But as you know, on the other hand, we also use Cowboys and Rangers and 49ers as symbols for our mascots as well. So this long time conflict between American settlers and Native Americans, I mean, is exemplified in sports that we do. If you went to visit the town of Whitesboro, New York, at least until 2016, this welcomed you as you're rolling up with your family to Whitesboro, New York, right? The city council members, when they were debating this in 2016, said they were dancing, right? Or just kind of wrestling or something. I don't know. That's a pretty hard sell. So, but this sign was taken down in 2016. And finally, let me finish with this. In the year 2000, the Secretary of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, a Pawnee person by the name of Kevin Grover, said about the Indian schools and the conquest and removal of natives the following. And remember, he's expressing the official policy of the federal government. He was the secretary, he was the Bureau of Indian Affairs Secretary. Let us begin by expressing our profound sorrow for what our agency has done in the past. This agency participated in the ethnic cleansing that befell the Western tribes, the decimation of the mighty bison herds, the use of the poison alcohol to destroy mind and body. Many people say that's why Whiskeytown is named Whiskeytown. The local native peoples were traded whiskey in order to get that land, but I'm still looking into that. And the cowardly killing of women and children, like at the Sand Creek Massacre. Such suffering made for a tragedy on a scale so ghastly that it cannot be dismissed as the merely inevitable consequence of the clash of competing ways of life. By accepting the legacy, we accept the moral responsibility of putting things right. Okay, I hope this lecture will help you ace this part, and remember to read that 5-page justification that Pratt wrote, Kill the Indian and Save the Man.